Thanks, folks, for being here. I'm Soham. I'm founder of Composio. We build tooling harness for agents. If you want to build an agent that connects with sort of a bunch of applications and does knowledge work, Composio is probably the right tool for you. I'll talk about some of the things that we kind of see in practice, some of the problems we face, and how we sort of use learning loop to solve for it. This is more about just talking about our journey and like how we sort of ended up doing a bunch of different things that I believe are pretty cool. And yeah, happy to sort of share the insights. So if you think about like agent essentially, like agents composed of, and there are various definitions, but agents composed mainly of model, loops, prompt, and tools. Tools allow you to sort of interact with the world and then basically sort of act on it. Model and prompt allows you to sort of pretty much steer it the right way. And loop is what sort of gives it the power to sort of do a more complicated task. If we look at like sort of the journey on like the tooling layer and like how sort of tooling has evolved, you saw like pretty much at the beginning like function calling coming in, which was not the most reliable, but kind of started with, and then you saw like on top of that XML coming in, and then at some point sort of we had MCP coming in and sort of becoming the sort of layer, and now we have like sort of code execution and like code mode kind of coming in and trying to sort of like also be one way via which sort of models able to act on the world via interacting via code, which eventually executes sort of the tools. Composio is kind of building tooling harness, which sounds very confusing. And so what I would probably do is I'll just take like 2 to 5 minutes just to explain like what we do and like what we sort of help with, and then tell you more about the problems we ended up sort of facing. So you can think of a very simple task, right? Which is like email our 100 last customers and tell them that we are going to be hosting a conference and they should definitely come to it, right? And this task has so much different things associated underneath that allow an agent like pretty much like an agent would not be able to sort of execute it simply because hey, there's an ontology, right? Like what do I call my customers? How is the data stored? Where's the email sort of coming from, right? What am I supposed to sort of send out? Do we have a brand language that at an enterprise level or at an organization level we sort of adhere to? How is the message supposed to be sent out? Do we have a tool like customer.io or any other sort of emailing tool that we sort of use internally that allows me to sort of pretty much send out a bulk email or whatever, something like that, right? And this is hard simply because like all of this is tribal knowledge that is associated to an organization that an agent like out there, like if you're sort of just building it, wouldn't be aware of. And like this is something that you are expected to sort of impose when you're sort of coding this out. One of the things that we do, and just to explain quickly, like we essentially allow you to do something like this. And the way we sort of go about it is we'll sort of do auth and validation. Like, so we will allow you to authenticate, authorize, and connect your agent to a bunch of different tools. I'll not get super deep in it because for this sort of talk, it's not going to be the most important thing. But the other thing we do is we sort of allow you to dynamically import a plan or a skill inside your agent, and that skill will be sort of injected with like the knowledge that typically that your organization will have. And this is where things get interesting. So let me quickly show you a demo on how this looks like, and then we can sort of check this out. So if you see this, you pretty much see like the idea is that I have a bunch of different tools at an enterprise or an organization level. I pretty much have like close to 10,000, 20,000 different tools that my agents use. How do I sort of search across it? How do I sort of plan across it is pretty complicated in nature, right? And so we essentially allow you to sort of create this like a single SDK that like allows very easily to sort of inject that into your agent as a context that allows your agent to sort of manage this. When you think about like sort of the plan is like pretty complicated because the idea is, oh, as an organization, this is how I sort of do things, and this is like my CRM, and this is how we manage it, and this is my sort of emailing tool, and this is how we manage it. And all of that sort of leads to this complication that, oh, the knowledge is like very sort of siloed in like how we do, or how the marketing team does it, or how sort of my team acts on it. One of the things we end up doing is we also inject, hey, what are the things that as an agent you should not be doing? What are the things that we have seen you make mistakes before, that pretty much are mistakes that are so common that we will advise you not to sort of get into. And so some of the mistakes we have sort of written here, but again, this essentially leads to a very high accuracy because like the common trajectories where the agent ends up failing are sort of covered up and pretty much prevented. Another cool thing we do is, again, basically we allow the agent to have sort of code snippets that are ready to execute. And then again, the idea here is that as an agent, like you are trying to execute a loopy task, like, hey, send out 1,000 emails, right? You're not going to sort of do it one by one. You're pretty much going to write a code snippet. That code snippet is going to interact with your sort of tools and allow you to execute this task. The problem you end up getting into is like if your code snippets like off by even like one small thing, you end up sort of sending out 1,000 emails with empty subjects or 1,000 emails with like bodies of email that are not really sort of worth sending out, and that creates a lot of problems. And so one cool thing we do is like we see that, oh, this is the code snippet that should ideally be used because we have seen this in practice, and this is something that is ready to go for the agent out there. So one of the things that we have always seen in practice that we are trying to sort of avoid is like when the agent comes back and tells you that, hey, the task was executed successfully, and in practice it wasn't. There was like one small quirky error that we just kind of missed, and now because of that, like sort of the task execution is pretty much going to like fail. The reason sort of we see these failures are because of bunch of reasons, but in practice it's pretty much because, oh, there are like a bunch of different tools that need to be sort of used to execute a task, and to use them in the right order is pretty complicated. So an example would be like, oh, I want to go create a lead, but creating a lead requires me to create a contact first, and creating a contact requires me to do this other thing first. Or I want to go onboard an employee on Rippling, but like creating a employee on Rippling requires me to do this other few things first. And like it's pretty unknown at the beginning. And so you see these trajectories where like agents essentially trying to figure out what to do to essentially get it right. And that leads to a lot of sort of errors that happen in practice where like you basically have bad data being injected into your systems just because like agent was trying to do something where it didn't really figure out. The second is, of course, the ontology drift, which is like how your organization manages something and how sort of they go about it. And then the third thing is just like very weird, sort of quirky things that every organization has in terms of like the tribal knowledge around like how a typical workflow looks like. And those things are pretty much like isolated and not sort of easily figured out by agent, which leads to a lot of sort of obvious errors coming in. And Composio has like close to 50,000 tools. And so we lead into sort of a bunch of other problems where like even if one tool ends up being sort of incorrect, we face an issue where like the whole chain kind of breaks, and that leads to a bunch of other sort of issues coming in. And this problem becomes like super prevalent for us. And this is the sort of problem that we kind of recognize. And the reason it becomes very important is because even if a parameter is off, you basically see like this whole complicated sort of agent loop literally like breaking in and not being able to execute any task. We have seen like sort of learning applied two ways. The first sort of learning approach is like you can basically change the model. You can use those trajectories to sort of fine tune a model. You can retrain it and a bunch of other things. The second sort of thing that we kind of do is we tune the harness and we figure out like, oh, how do we sort of maximally get the efficient output based on the basis of the trajectories that we have seen in terms of like how do we sort of tune the harness. So how we sort of do learning is pretty much um, very simple. We essentially see every time an agent sort of tries to execute a task through us, we figure out like whether the task ended up successfully executing or it ended up failing. The successful execution allows you to sort of basically use like English language LLM as a judge and figure out like what went right, what part of the sort of tool execution chain was sort of done correctly. And then the failures allow you to figure out like what are the quirky things that essentially end up leading to like the agent trace kind of failing. one of the clear observations that we saw across the data was close to 80% of errors ended up happening because of the same like few reasons across every single organization that ended up using us. And so we could build like very smart guardrails around it, where we could sort of inject this into the organization's agent loop by default, so that like they could prevent those errors from ever happening. The other cool thing we started doing was we understood that the way you sort of inject those skills dynamically also determines how accurate the eventual sort of trajectory is. And so we started experimenting a lot with A/B testing on like how to inject a plan and how to sort of figure that out. The second sort of learning loop we kind of sort of went into was the tool learning loop, right? So think about Salesforce or think about GitHub. You have like close to 500 different things an agent can do on top of it. And building typed tools that could be code executable across is a very hard task, and maintaining those tools is again equally hard. And so what we started doing was, for the tasks that could essentially have some sort of risk, you could essentially allow the agent to call the raw API if the agent feels confident enough, and use that raw API trace to essentially create type tool on the backend. And this is super useful if you have a lot of like custom fields and a lot of custom parameters where you're not really sure if the tool exists today in the stack for an agent to do something. But if you could give agent like some sort of free run to read the structure and like have some control over the accuracy at which agent's able to make the wrong API call, you could essentially use very few traces to dynamically construct a type tool, which essentially agent could use and then keep using it to sort of maintain and like update new versions. So we ended up doing that. That allows us to sort of very quickly maintain and sort of batch update tools. And that's like a significant sort of data source in specifically like working with applications where like the custom fields could be huge. So we combine basically planning and the tool loop that allows us to sort of construct plans that are pretty complicated, but also make sure that the agent sort of doesn't make the simple mistakes, already has some code snippets available, and is able to sort of execute tasks very efficiently. And on the other hand, we also have sort of the tool loop that allows it to sort of efficiently keep discovering new tools, keep creating those tools, updating those tools, and essentially reflect back on the plans and like keep both of those two things in the loop. Yeah, we do 10 million sort of tool calls a day, and that's like a significant sort of data that goes back into the tool creation, and that helps sort of us with the whole learning loop. Yeah, this is pretty much it. Thanks a lot for watching. We are also hiring, so if anyone's interested in this problem, would definitely appreciate folks reaching out.